Hi, my name is Marcella Leonard. I'm the Director of Leonard Consultancy, and I have been asked by the Health and Social Care Board to provide a narrated PowerPoint looking at understanding children's sexual behaviour. And I suppose what we want you to think about here is this is seen as a level one introduction to really, I suppose, getting some sense of that incredibly difficult question, which is what is normal sexual behaviour for children, and moving on then to what is the behaviour that we should be worried about. So this is a narrated PowerPoint which will last about an hour. And the idea, as I said, it's to give you some introduction to beginning to have some of the, I suppose, increase your confidence and the competency around making a judgment call, depending in the area of work that you're working in, whether that is in relation to you're working in, preschool sort of settings, school settings, whether it's in voluntary settings, whether it's charitable, whether it's in sports settings, whether it's in social care, education, whatever that is in your settings that you're working with children and engaging with children and interacting with children, but also as a parent in terms of trying to gain some understanding of children's sexual behaviour. So what we're aiming to do is we're going to take a look in terms of understanding what is children's sexual behaviour, and that's really to help then in the decision making whenever you're to identify is there a problem and then assessment for intervention. So we're going to look at in terms again understanding what is normal, what's inappropriate and what is harmful in the context of children's sexual behaviour within their developmental stages, which is really, really important that we understand there is developmental stages, and therefore part of the assessment of what is normal and what is maybe of concern is really gauged around what stage that young person is at, that child, but also then to have an insight as to maybe what action to take. And it's extremely difficult, as you can imagine, in a narrated PowerPoint to cover every possible scenario that you're going to potentially come across and how to best deal with that. Because let's be honest, that's about, where you are at the time, the location, the child, who else is around, whether you're in a private space or a public space, whether or not the child is your own child, whether or not it's a child who's been left in your care, whether it's a child that you're providing some sort of service with in terms of, is it a school setting, is it a sports setting? So it's all, every one of those situations matter in terms of how we actually deal with it. But I'm going to try and guide you through some, I suppose, some general advice and guidance that might help you in this journey. So when we're assessing and understanding sexual behaviour, probably the best way, and again, all of this is not about that there is I suppose for me, there's not necessarily saying this is the only way to deal with something, but what helps those of us who specialise in, firstly, in understanding sexual behaviour, and then also to specialise in the whole area of assessing and intervening, particularly when that behaviour becomes of concern, is I tend to use this, which is around looking at is the behaviour normal? Is it a normal behaviour for the child and for their developmental stage? Or has it moved into being maybe inappropriate and causing some concern? Or has it moved into, I suppose, that other area which is to be termed more problematic and therefore potentially causing harm to the young person, to the child themselves, or potentially to other children, or which can also be another case is maybe to adults as well, or for example in very extreme cases it may be they cause harm to animals or to something like that. So in some ways, what already, when we're only into the third slide, it's about that concern and about how significantly serious children's sexual behaviour can become. But really important to stress that the majority of children do not engage in concerning or harmful or problematic sexual behaviour. But what I do want to be clear with you is that all children are sexual. And that's really important that we recognize that. And it's really important that you come to terms with, because sometimes people sort of feel, well, they're children, so they're asexual really and not sexual until they reach their adolescence. But that's not the case. We're born sexual. Part of our, from the very moment of conception, our sexuality begins. And we need to therefore be very clear and open to accepting our children and ourselves that we are sexual beings and that sexuality starts from conception. But what is also very clear as well is that it is really important that our children are introduced to their sexuality and educated about their sexuality at appropriate stages and what is well meant for them and what is within their ability to understand. So therefore we don't expose them too soon to material and that we don't overexpose them to information, but that equally at the same time we don't leave them so protected that they are unable to protect themselves as well, so that they don't understand what is happening to them. So I'm a great believer in that with each developmental stage, we educate as parents and as adults, that we educate them as their developmental stage is progressing, and that we don't seek to shield them so much so that they also don't learn, because understanding their sexuality and their bodies is really important, the same way as it is to understand the normal other functions of their body as well. So it's about that, a progressive approach to understanding sexuality. And therefore, when you have that progressive approach, it's much easier to probably have an analysis of, is the behavior that they're doing normal? Is it of some concern? Or has it moved into problematic? Now, those of us, and I would specialise in looking at when the behaviour becomes more problematic and harmful, and what we do within that is we move that sort of arrow a bit. We use the Simon Hackett continuum of young people's sexual behaviour, and what you can see here is that it moves from normal, which is developmentally expected, and it's socially accepted, consensual, mutual, reciprocatal, sort of normal sexual behaviour, into what is inappropriate and sort of single incidences of what's socially accepted, maybe within a peer group, but certainly not if they engaged in that behaviour maybe with a younger child, into the problematic that we just mentioned in the arrow, and what that problematic behaviour potentially would be causing harm to the young person themselves, or could potentially cause that behaviour to be harmful and problematic and hurtful towards another person. But what we've also done within Simon's continuum is that he is also breaking that down into using very much that language of it becoming abusive behaviour, where there's clearly that they have caused harm to another individual, where there is a creation of a victim, that there is an exploitation within that, there's coercion, it's intrusive. But also there is a fifth element to the continuum, which is when there is the presence of violence and much more physically aggressive sexualized behaviour. Now, it is incredibly important for you to understand that not all children and young people who engage in harmful sexual behaviour would necessarily meet that criteria of violent. It's, at the more extreme end of behaviours, but that's not to say it doesn't happen. So often what we're dealing with probably is more within that problematic and abusive and harmful sexual behaviour, but some will present with the violence. So therefore it's important for me to raise your awareness of that. But in terms of addressing and beginning to understand it, what I want you to think of here is I'm going to use the green, amber and red, because I think that's very simple concept of green. It's something that we're okay with, amber is something we're a bit worried about, and red being something that we're very concerned about. And so therefore, when you're addressing sexual behaviours, what I want you to think about is, as I go on into the talk, and you'll see that in the slides, I'm using that green, amber and red sort of colour sort of concept. Really, for me, normal sexual behaviour that young people and children engage in is an invitation to educate. And I want you to see it as that, is that when children engage in sexual behaviour, often what might tend to happen is that adults may have a laugh about it, and they may tell other adults about it. They may indeed encourage the child maybe to repeat the behavior, that they have fun about it. However, what I want you to think about is that normal sexual behavior is also an opportunity to educate. And it's really the child inviting you to start to educate them, and sort of see it as that. When you have children, they tell us when they're ready to learn something as well. And therefore, when I would have a child who, for example, is maybe seeking to ask some questions about babies, or whenever maybe, for example, they're running around the house, with their clothes off and thinking it's funny, and whenever then, for example, they want to show you their new pants that they've got bought for them. There is absolutely nothing wrong with those behaviours in a preschool child. Nothing wrong with those behaviours at all. However, I feel that those are opportunities in a very, very calm way to begin to invite, to educate the child about private parts, and about, I suppose for me, that, the NSPCC sort of pants rule, in terms of, making sure that they understand that there's nothing wrong in their home of running around after a bath, but that also it's really important that we begin to educate about keeping, the parts of our body private, and understanding that we don't show our pants to everybody and things like that. So I want you to see green as an opportunity and an invitation by children to educate, and maybe have a reflection on how often we don't necessarily do that as parents, or as if we're involved in educating, in terms of whether we are, other social care colleagues, whether it's in sports, whether it's in youth clubs. So think about that. Think about green being an invitation to educate. Amber for me is about where you've identified that it's inappropriate and you are concerned, and therefore see these as an invitation to intervene, to re-educate. So for example, maybe the child has already been told, and maybe a parent is saying to you, look, I've advised my daughter or my son not to do that, but you see it happening again. So again, think about that. Is it an invitation to re-educate the child? Because again, don't forget, all children learn at different levels in life. All children, we, have to have messages repeated to them. But for example, if we have a child that maybe has of some educational sort of additional needs, we might need to give that message on numerous occasions. And you know what? That's okay too. But also it could be about preventing. So don't forget, the amber is also about, as is the normal, it's about preventing and making sure that, that behavior is appropriately managed by the child, that they understand we don't go around showing our private parts to other people. But also it helps them understand as well that no other person has the right to touch their private parts. So it's about also really beginning to see that about prevention. When we move into the red, when you identify problematic and harmful behaviours, one of the core messages I would ask you to really be alert to here is that do not see that the referral of a young person or a child to social services or to a specialist service that deals with harmful sexual behaviour. Please do not see those as labeling the child. Don't wait until it gets to red. One of the I suppose the abiding things that I really struggle with is that whenever I'm engaging in an assessment of a young person as a child or as a child, is that whenever I take their history, how often I could see, actually, if that child had been referred in for some education work maybe 3 years previously, they wouldn't be sitting with a red area with me. They wouldn't be sitting with a harmful sexual behaviour. In fact, they should have been coming to me when it was just at this inappropriate stage. Not minimising inappropriate, but at that stage. So sometimes what tends to happen, whether that's we as parents, whether it's as professionals, voluntary workers, whatever our role is in life, is that sometimes we think referring the child in is going to label the child. But for me, particularly in the field of sexuality, and let's be honest, sometimes we're awkward as adults talking about sexuality. The sooner we can identify, is there starting of the presenting of an issue for sexuality, the sooner we get the young person the right education to manage that, the sooner we can prevent anything progressing from inappropriate into problematic. So let's have a much more maybe progressive approach in terms of referring them through. So what I'm going to do then is take you through sort of developmental stages. I mean, I've broken these down into sort of that 0 to 6 age group, the 7 to 11, and the 12 to 16. And obviously then we've got the 16 to 18, but that's slightly different because of the age of consent. What I have done as well then is I've broken these down into looking at what is normal, what would I expect is normal within that age group, what is of concern, and what is harmful. Now, it is really important as we go through these slides to recognise 0 to 6 is a huge area in terms of that's a lot of years to be covering. So we can't cover every one of those years, but this is to give you a broad understanding of what would you be expecting at each one of these developmental stages. So let's take first one. If we take a look in terms of 0 to 6, so what would we see is actual normal sexual behaviour? So at this stage, okay, this is a brilliant wee age group. This is this age group where everything in the world is so exciting and new and getting to understand and exploring themselves. And therefore it is about exploratory interest in their own body parts. But they have such a great interest in it, and they will play with their body parts, and they will enjoy it, themselves being naked in the bath and playing with water, and for example, if they are a wee boy, they'll enjoy pulling their penis and stretching it and all of those sorts of things. So they'll explore their body parts, and that's perfectly normal. But they'll have an interest, for example, as well in their friends' body parts as well, but also the adults. So they'll begin, to see sort of mummy's breasts, and they'll understand that, how come daddy's penis is larger than theirs, and they'll point it out and they'll look. So there's an interest in body parts, but also they have an interest in the functions of body parts, which can cause, at times, believe me, some quite interesting concepts in terms of being obsessed about toileting, for example, and talking about toileting and poos and, all of those sorts of things. But also that younger child, whenever that baby is being changed, the nappy's changed, as soon as the nappy is taken off, where does the hand go? They're a bit like octopuses. You need several hands here to stop the hand going down to the genital area and to touch it. And that's because the nappy has been rubbing against their genitals, and they're wondering what is that is down there. So that stimulus that is caused by the nappy. So touching and doing all of that, but also beginning to put their hand down to their genital area. At times, it maybe when they're a bit anxious or a bit worried, and sort of seeing that as a wee bit of a comfort area. So lots of asking questions about their body, breasts, penis, babies, but they also would begin to get some sense of sort of in beginning to sort of think about inserting things into their genitals. So certainly beginning to see, well, and looking up, but not actually doing the insertion, but certainly looking to sort of go, does something go in, and poking and things like that, particularly up towards that sort of older year within here, so that sort of 5, 6 years of age, because they have a bit of a sense of things coming out of there. So there's a bit of exploratory, but not necessarily doing any insertion, but that idea of looking about this, what can go in here. But also wee boys will have erections, and that is a perfectly normal physiological response of boys. Role playing mummy and daddy, doctors, nurses, wanting to be naked. And that's all perfectly normal. So for example, an example here would be, say if I had 2 4-year-olds, running around and showing each other their underwear. That's a perfectly normal sexual behaviour example. But what I would ask you to do here in terms of responding to that is, rather than maybe, which could be a thing, is sort of maybe laugh at them doing it or whatever. Again, as I've said, use that as an opportunity to educate it, but without obviously not scolding them, because there's nothing wrong with the behaviour. So what you would do there is have an example. It would be to explain about, for example, maybe the pants rule, maybe in terms of explaining that the body parts are private, and the importance that we don't go around showing our pants to everybody, and it's important to keep that private. But also what you would do as well is that you would also seek to distract them, to let them see that they don't really focus on that, and it's important. So that would be a normal example of a normal sort of behaviour. If we move then in terms then of looking at what would be inappropriate at this stage. So that would be where maybe they continue to touch their own or genital areas even when you've asked them not to. So, as depending on what your role is with the child, if you've asked them not to do that, and you're quite clear about, you've given them a clear instruction not to do it, and they still do, but also that they're doing that even when you've tried to distract them, maybe with a play of some sort, and that they're harder to distract, and you can just see that, and they're becoming a bit more, I don't want to use the word necessarily preoccupied in its full sense, but certainly they seem to be paying more attention to it. There's more maybe frequent insertion of objects in that they do become quite obsessed about their genitalia. They might be pulling the clothes of others down against their will. So maybe if I gave the example there previously of, two 4-year olds showing each other their underwear, but maybe if one of those 4-year olds actually pulls down the underwear of the other child, and that other child is very clearly did not want that, and the other child is upset by that, and even when you've asked that 4-year old not to do that, they do repeat that behaviour. So beginning to becoming more concerned about the sexual behaviour. But also is that maybe they begin to engage in masturbatory behavior, with objects, rubbing themselves against others, rubbing themselves against things. So you're beginning to see that although moving on from what was a green, which was showing an interest in their genitalia, maybe rubbing themselves a bit, but they were very easily distracted. They weren't obsessed by it. They weren't becoming or distressed by it either. This is getting much more of an example of the child doing it on a more frequent basis, the child doing it in a more obsessive type way, and the child becoming much more harder to distract from the behaviours. An example of this as well would be maybe, for example, if we have maybe a 4-year old lying on top of a 3-year-old and they're talking about playing mummies and daddies, but they've got, if you can imagine, sort of an appropriate position that, so very much lying on top, legs open, and it looks as if, maybe the male child is very clearly role playing the active male adult role. So again, what you would do here, if that's your first time to find that, incident happening, you would talk to them about, how do they, listen to how they know that that's mummies and daddies. So again, has their knowledge of that come from an appropriate source? So for example, have they walked in and seen mummy and daddy, or did they see it on the TV? So you're listening out for an appropriate source, not an abusive source, obviously, but an appropriate source to hear that. But you're educating them that that's behaviour just for adults and that they need to know that, but you're trying to distract them from that behaviour. But what you need to be alert to here is that if that behaviour gets repeated again, despite you having educated them before, that you need to be again understanding how come that behaviour is being repeated despite you having told them not to do it. So again, that's causing of concern because it's being repeated despite some education, and looking at that. If we go on then to take a look at then what would be problematic at this age, and that's where they're clearly engaging in sexual play which is aggressive, it's painful, it's causing upset, and that they can see that it's causing upset, where despite you advising them not to engage in touching of themselves in public, that they're doing that and ignoring it to the level of maybe other play. So if other children are there and they're playing away, but actually the child is sitting and is engaging in masturbatory behaviour of themselves, where there is the simulation of, or indeed they actually try to engage in sexual intercourse, hugely concerning, the use of force or coercion with other children, and where they clearly are trying to insert the objects into the genitalia. So it's not, for example, in the green where I'm saying they might have maybe try to do, but they're not actually inserting, but they're trying to sort of explore themselves. This is where they are, and including into their rectum, into their bum, which can cause pain. Also here now beginning to pick up sexualized language, but also, picking up sexualized language used appropriately, if that makes sense. So in other words, the sexualized language and inappropriate language is referring to the right parts of the body and to the right actions. So therefore, again, beginning to wonder where have they learned that from. And also being more secretive with their play and their behaviour. So for an example of that will be where maybe you might begin to see maybe a 3-year-old rubbing herself against furniture, using toys for stimulation, for masturbating, despite the fact that any attempts to distract her has not worked with play, that you can see it's repeating frequently whenever you've been asked to, you've asked them not to do that behaviour. And you can see that the child is actually becoming quite distressed by the fact that they clearly are being stimulated, but there is a frustration and that they are becoming obsessed about it. But also, for example, other examples will be here maybe where we have maybe a child who attempts to engage in penetrative sexual activity with another child, and that they seek to insert and that they have got the actions correct. So again, you're wondering where's that information came from. So what I would want you to be thinking about here is, has the child learned that through observation of a behavior? Doesn't necessarily mean to say that that has been observed in an abusive way. So, for example, maybe they themselves have, maybe seen something on television. There wasn't maybe the right parental controls in the television, but they've seen it, or which is the observation, or has it been sadly maybe by experience? So, is the child repeating sexual behaviours which sadly has been done to them? So, therefore, we're working with a victim of sexual abuse. So, you're beginning to try to understand here, has the sexual language and the sexual behaviours came as a result of what has happened to them, or has it come out of observation? And observation through which route? So has it been through television? Has it been through seeing adults? Has it been through the internet? Has it been through maybe, and very sadly, even at this age, through being exposed to pornography? So you're beginning to try to get some understanding of where that has come from, but a much more overt sexuality with the child at this stage. We move on then in terms then of looking at 7 to 11-year-olds, in terms of looking at what is normal. So again, we've got continued curiosity about the body parts, but this age group are much more aware of privacy. They're much more aware of engaging in private about their act. So for example, things like bathing, things like toileting. This is the difference in this age group where, for example, that previous age group, when you took them to the beach, you were running after them to try to get their swimming costume on them, and you were the one putting the towel around them to try to keep them private when you're trying to change them, because they just wanted to run on the sand. This age group here is the ones who will not go unless they won't change unless you put the towel around them, and they have a much more of an awareness of privacy. But also they're asking more specific questions about sexuality. There's a greater knowledge here, so their questions are much more specific, but again done in much more of a, it's not about a shyness, but they're aware of the sensitivity of what they're asking. There's an awareness of it being a topic that is not openly talked about, just around the dinner table necessarily as such. So therefore there's an alertness and an awareness of sexuality and sexual questions being something that you maybe ask your mum or your dad in private. But also there's the awareness of sexual slang language for parts of the body, that they're aware of. But also they're beginning to seek to inform themselves about sex through the internet and through books. I would still hope that some of them will look at books, although I'm very aware a lot of them will be using the internet. And therefore, this is where we begin now to get some differences in terms of, I suppose, age differences here and generational differences. Whereas for most of us, including myself, whenever I was in this age group, you would have been still seeking to get that information from books, because of children's access today through smartphones and internet and all of that, and indeed the programs that are available, is that their information of sexuality and sexual behaviours is much greater because they have access to that, and that's not necessarily coming from an abusive way. And we need to be alert to that. So therefore, it's about an awareness of how did they get this information, and has that been through an appropriate way. So an example of this will be, for example, is a 7-year old boy, maybe whenever he's watching TV, putting his hand down to, and under his trousers to his pants, and sitting holding his genitalia whenever he's relaxed and he's watching TV. And that's that sort of comfort thing, and it is about that bit of sort of beginning to be aware of their bodies and asking questions, and seeking to know That's perfectly fine, normal sexualized behavior, normal sexual behavior, not sexualized, but sexual behavior. And that moves then into that 10 and 11-year-old, for example, with the girls, much more aware of the progression in terms of development of their breasts, much more around in terms of wanting to find out more information about sex. That's all in keeping with what we know is, girls developmental, their body's developing quicker, so they're wanting to know that information, which is why I'm very clear. See these green areas as an invitation to educate, not a time to sort of not answer these questions, but as an invitation to educate. Okay, if we take a look in terms of what is sort of inappropriate and of concern at this stage, you're talking about maybe self-masturbation in public after being obviously educated that not to do that, that there's an increased focus on masturbation, whether that's in private or in public, and you're beginning to get a sense of that child increasingly doing it. And so, for example, maybe doing it in school, maybe doing it at the youth club, maybe doing it at their sporting activities, maybe doing it in the family home, but not always in private. So you're beginning to get a sense of the child wanting to engage in the behaviour, but that there is something around the location, the context, and the frequency of when they're doing it. Persistent inappropriate language and behaviour, even when asked to, and you're getting that maybe in multiple places. So maybe at home, maybe at the youth club, maybe in the sports, but also maybe in schools. You're beginning to pick up that no matter when the child is being told that that's not appropriate language, they're continuing to do that. But also explicit sexual talk, actively touching others and maybe pulling their clothes down, simulating or actual sexual intercourse, seeking to but not actually accessing adult material, maybe through the internet. So all of concern, all of quite inappropriate for that age group, but not necessarily at this stage have we always necessarily got that they're doing it towards other people, but they themselves are clearly evidencing that they're becoming sexualized, and we need to be very clear about that. And so, for example, in terms of that would be where you might have a young boy maybe of 10 who's asking younger girls to show them their boobs, to have sex with them, asking others about sex, that and no matter how often being advised not to do the behavior, is that they continue to do that behavior, and there's a sexualized sort of undertone to maybe some of the language that they're using. Again, in terms of addressing this and working with this, you would be very much talking to that young person, young child, as about what is not appropriate about their behaviour, explaining about the importance of private parts, explaining about what part of this behaviour they're concerned about. For example, if they are being sexually inappropriate in their language towards somebody, if they're, what's harmful about that, how can that impact on somebody. You'd be talking about the impact maybe on what is that like for that girl when you're asking her to show their boobs. What is that like about the language of using the language of boobs? So again, using it to educate, but very much beginning to see, particularly of their age, that it's not appropriate and how come they have that. So you'd be educating, but if that's repeating despite you giving that initial education, then it's of more concern. And what I would be suggesting here at this stage is that's when I would be seeking to get a referral for some clear sex education with that young person to try to make sure to prevent before we move into stage 3. And stage 3 here is very much that excessive masturbation, sexually aggressive towards themselves or others, simulation of the actual sexual behavior towards others, but in much more an aggressive and a more proactive way. Looking to seek out sexual material through maybe the sending and receiving of sexual material through technology, maybe accessing adult pornography, taking imagery of themselves and sending that to another young person, maybe blackmailing a young person to send them some material through their phone, through the use of technology. And again, it's about understanding that when you have a child who sends a picture of themselves to another child, that is indecent imagery of children. And it's about being alert to that, and that we are, obviously would be very concerned about that. Sexual activity with animals. Again, children do engage in sexual activity with animals. It's not something that I can say to you doesn't happen. It does. And therefore, this is something we want to be alert to immediately. We don't wait for it to happen a second time. I would want to make sure that that referral would come through as soon as possible. But also, evidence of threatening coercive behaviour towards others. So again, recognizing that whenever there's the use of aggression or violence or coercion, and even if that's bullying at whatever level, you need to recognize and see that that is of significant concern and is harmful, because really that's giving you the indication that this child is wanting their sexual needs met regardless of how that is affecting another person. And obviously that's something we would want to engage with, work with that young person as soon as possible. So that would be of very clearly problematic and harmful. When we move into that sort of 12 to 16 sort of age group here, we're looking at slightly different here, because there's quite a big gap here, but as there is in the others. But let's look at the normal. So the normal would be for that 12 to 16, they're adolescents. And let's be very realistic here in terms of the information available to adolescents at this stage, in terms of through using smartphones, in terms of access to the internet, and even through movies, TV programs. There's a much more, I suppose, openness of sexual information. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's always correct sexual information, and it doesn't always mean to say that it's appropriate for them to be seeing it at that age. But for this age group, what is normal? And normal is engaging in sexual chat with their peers, having sexual language, about masturbating. It's also about engaging in sexual behaviour with their peers, kissing, foreplay, and obviously then when they move up to that 16 years of age, that they will engage in sexual intercourse that is obviously consensual. But we also have to be realistic that some 15, 16-year-olds will engage in sexual intercourse with each other. Of course, it's under the age of consent if they're 15, but that this is more about a recognition of what the young people are engaging in. And is it normal that they would want to do that? Yes, it is. But if we are aware that they're doing it, this is about the education. Really important. It's not about making them feel that this is a bad behavior that they're doing, but it's about educating in terms of consent. It's about educating in relation to keeping themselves safe. It's also about education in relation to contraception, sexually transmitted infections. All of those things need to be given to young people at this age, so that therefore their decision to engage in a behavior is done with a very much that underpinning of respect, mutual consent, but also about the biological of keeping themselves safe as well. There will also be, what is normal here at this age, is an interest in that sexually explicit material and an interest in pornography. And also about us as adults being very clear is that they have access to that. It's not that they can't get access to it, they can. What we're looking at here, though, is it's normal to have the interest. It's about whenever that interest becomes of concern is what is the main thing that we're worried about at this stage. So normal sexual behavior here at this stage is engaging in it, talking about it, wanting to know more about it, and wanting to engage in it is perfectly normal. But it's really about, in terms of what's inappropriate, is that that sexual chat is happening through technology, that they're sharing imagery of themselves, of peers through technology, that there is single instance of inappropriate sexual activity. So that might be where I might, for example, have maybe a 14-year-old who engages in sexual activity with a 12-year-old. Again, both of them are under the age of consent. And so you'd be seeking to provide some education in relation to consent, but also the importance of that they need to bear in mind that neither the two of them could have consent, and in particular that 12-year-old cannot consent. So it may not necessarily have been against somebody's will, but we need to be clear in relation to consent. But we're also educating in terms of their bodies as well, where they're not being ready for this, both biologically, physically, and emotionally. And that we're very clear this is where they need education in terms of understanding that they need to wait until they're over the age of 16. But also then when they become to have maybe an excessive interest in looking at pornography, and that they, for me, for example, one of the things I would say to you is where maybe a young person of this age, it's more than just an interest, it's actually becoming a need. So it's that moving from that interest and I want to see what it is, and maybe using, for example, I'm not, it's not about giving an opinion on what I think about pornography, but it's about recognizing young people may want to see something. So sometimes that's about recognizing they may have an interest to see out of just curiosity. But what we're looking at here in terms of what's inappropriate and what's of concern is where the young person has moved to actually needing it. At this stage of sexual development, they have a normal sexual drive, so therefore they're already starting to have a sexual interest. So it's perfectly normal to have an interest and a curiosity. What's of concern is where that interest has become quite excessive, where you're aware that they're watching a lot of pornography, that they're seeking to watch pornography, that, for example, that that they are paying to go onto websites to watch it, where that for example, overnight, you know 12, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, that they're on the internet, and if you do any searching of their internet, that they potentially are accessing pornography sites. That's of concern. So we really are it's moving from an interest into much more of an excessive interest, and moving into a needing of that. Obviously of concern is seeking to engage in any sexual activity with younger children. That is of concern, and we would want to, again, what I'm saying is use amber as a stage of do not hesitate, please, to refer them for sex education, through for specialist education. And the reason for that being is we're looking to prevent. So don't forget, amber is an invitation to intervene, to re-educate, and to prevent. And that's why it's important that the referrals need to come through at this stage and not wait to now this next stage. And obviously a red then in terms of this is where it is problematic. They're sexually preoccupied in their thoughts and behaviours, which really affects their daily functioning. So again, for example, you might be getting lots of different evidence of this from school, from their sports, from their voluntary activities, or indeed actually we're finding is that they're beginning to lose interest in some of those areas of their life because they're becoming excessively preoccupied about sexuality, where there's clear evidence of coercion of others in sexual activity and behaviours, where they're engaged in sexual activity through technology. For example, where they may be sending imagery of themselves, maybe they are engaging in sending imagery to adults, that they are looking at adult pornography sites, that they are on chat rooms, that are engaging in inappropriate sexual conversations with adults, and that they also can do this through their gaming machines as well. But they also have a self-reported or observed sexual interest in younger children, where they are trying to seek to be in the company of younger children, and they have engaged in sexual behaviour with younger children. That there also may be the evidence of unusual sexual behaviours, which would be sort of fetishes. So, for example, maybe foot fetishes, where they may be getting other younger people to maybe send them photographs of their feet, where they are becoming obsessed about that, where they maybe have engaged in sexual behaviour with animals, where they have engaged in behaviours of for example, maybe bondage type behaviours, tying themselves up, tying other people up, where they have got an interest in things. And again, for all of these, you'd begin to ask about those two words that I said earlier about, is it through observation? So have they observed this, and have they observed it then through appropriate ways, or non-appropriate ways, such as through maybe adult pornography, sadistic type behaviours of watching inappropriate material like that. And therefore beginning to look then in terms of, where did this aggressive sexual behaviour come from? And at this age again, we can have young people who are moving into, very clearly, if we go back to the Hackett continuum of behaviour, moving into that very clearly abusive and violent, where they use objects as weapons, and they cause significant pain to their victims. And we've got clearly victims caught up, and we can identify that, and that it is in frequency and in context very clearly abusive. When you have somebody evidence in that, it's hugely important that the referral goes immediately into Gateway, into social services, and referral through to the specialist harmful sexual behaviour services, which are in all of the trusts in Northern Ireland, where they will engage in that. But what I'm really strongly advocating with you in this PowerPoint is, a lot of these evident behaviours are, we can see them when they're amber and they're of concern, but that people have a hesitation maybe in making that referral through, for fear of labelling, of the impact on the young person. What I would say to you from my experience is, it's so much more preventative. It's also better for the child if we refer at the times of inappropriate, when at that stage we maybe need to do a less of an intervention, but it's an intervention that will prevent them moving on into engaging in more harmful sexual behaviours. For those young people then who have reached that 16 to 18, this is much more different, obviously, because they are of the age of consent, and therefore what we would see would be normal is engaging in consensual peer or older sexual activity. And when I mean older, I mean that you might have a 16-year-old engaging in it with an 18-year-old, and as long as, again, that is mutual consent, we need to be aware of that, but that they have a sexual knowledge and they have a sexual interest, and that behaviour is acceptable and understandable at their developmental stage. What, like all of the other previous developmental stage, is if there's evidence of coercion of others in the sexual activity, where there becomes sexual preoccupation, which is impacting on their daily functioning, or where they move, for example, which would become into much more of the red, into a harmful sexual behaviour, where they engage in sexually deviant or illegal activity. So again, that would be where there's coercion, where there's violence, where there's clear abuse, where there is clear physical potential sexual harm to the victims, whether engaging in sexual activity with prepubescent children, younger children, where there's that clear use of aggression or violence. That's evidence of a very much a red at that 16 to 18 years of age, which is similar to all of the other developmental stages. But also some of that can also be through, for example, the use of technology, exploitation of other young people, and or could be of adults either, through technology. What we're also looking at here for you should consider in each of the developmental stages is the context to how, where, and when the sexual behaviour occurred. So again, for example, if the behaviour has happened after the children have watched a movie, and that there has been kissing and sort of some sexual behaviour within that movie, and they go to repeat that, well, then again you can see that they're repeating behaviour they've just seen. But if that context is always within private, and for example, if I have a 6-year-old who takes a 3-year-old into a bedroom and closes the door and puts that 3-year-old onto the bed and tells that 3-year-old not to say anything, and it is a secret, and that 6-year-old then lies on top of the 3-year-old and simulates sexual intercourse, then obviously that context is clearly inappropriate, is of concern, because the complete context to it is raising concern. So for example, the privacy, saying it's a secret. So you have those elements in it in terms of to look out for, which would cause more concern than, for example, if you have two 6-year-olds who are laughing about playing mummies and daddies, but there's no physical demonstration of it, but they're talking about that daddy would lie on top of mummy, or mummy lies on top of daddy, and they're talking about it, but they're laughing about it, but there's not actually, and it's being done in front of others, and it's part of a play. That's then a different context. But again, the message I'm very clearly giving you is see that as an invitation to educate. Also, other considerations is how the child emotionally and behaviourally responds whenever you try to give that education. So for example, if you have seen a behaviour, and so for example, if you go in and the 6-year-old has said to the 3-year-old, but whenever you ask them, about it and tell me about what you're doing, and the child becomes aggressive, maybe the child becomes maybe upset, the child, sort of wants to blame the 3-year-old, that's not the response of a child who has been exposed to this behaviour in a non-abusive way. So in other words, again, the child knows there's something wrong, the child is angry at maybe being caught. So you begin to pick up that this is not a play as such, that it's maybe been led from much more of a different experience. So listen for the child's emotional behavioural response. Be aware of it and feel, does that fit with the context of what has happened, or has the child's response given you more of an indication that they are aware that there's something not okay about the behaviour, and that there's something that the child is aware of being concerned about. The other thing that you need to be aware of is that maybe the behaviour was sitting in green, and you thought, well, the behaviour isn't out of, it seems quite normal for that developmental stage. But whenever maybe you went to mention it to the parent, maybe the parent's response was not appropriate. Maybe the parent became quite aggressive about it, maybe very defensive about it, and so therefore, again, rather than a parent seeing it as an opportunity, the child needed to be educated. Maybe if the parent's response appeared to you to be either maybe over the top or of concern, or indeed, for example, if the behaviour was inappropriate. So, say for example, we have a concern that a child has taken an image of their genitalia and has sent that to another child, and the parent's response is, "But that's not a big deal, and sure, all young people do that." Well, that would be of concern. So again, you might find is that it's not only the behaviour that was of concern, but also the family response is of concern as well. But also looking about the impact on the other child, or indeed, don't forget that children can also cause inappropriate sexual behaviour through adults, and just see about, so again, for example, you might observe the behaviour, and that although you might feel the behaviour wasn't outside of maybe what we would see as maybe green in terms of normal behaviour, but maybe the child who they did it to has quite an adverse reaction. And again, that might give you an indication that that child has reacted differently to what maybe was seen as play. But they have reacted different, and maybe that's because maybe they themselves have been abused or is being currently abused, and here's another person who has done it to them. So don't lose sight of the impact on that child as maybe another indicator to protect that child, because maybe that's what they have experienced. So again, think about the impact on the other child or indeed the adult. Think about the frequency and the extent of the sexual behavior. So again, for example, if we advise them not to do a behaviour, I'm not saying they stop immediately, but they generally get the message after a couple of times when you say that it's not acceptable, and that if we've put, for example, maybe some consequences in place, if you've said, I'm talking about general behaviour, not sexual behaviour. But for example, in sexual behaviour, if we've said, we've done our education bit, that it's about privacy and it's about respect for our bodies, and we don't let other people see those private areas of our bodies. If we have done that and the child continues and we re-educate again, but they continue, and what we find is an increase, then it's that persistence after being educated that I would want you to consider, that maybe initially the behaviour you would have deemed to have been normal, but there is becoming much more of a persistence, and that might move it then into the of concern. In relation to then, I suppose, the greater clarity of the key elements of the sexual abusive behaviour, what I want you to think about here is that nature of that sexual abuse. What is it that they're doing that is abusive? Is it the extent of it? Is it that the fact that it is very clearly the knowledge? So for example, the 14-year-old having knowledge of sexual intercourse is not unusual, but the fact that they are wanting to engage in that with maybe a 10-year-old, that's the bit that we're saying is of concern. Not the fact that the 14-year-old knows about sexual intercourse and sexual activity, but it's who they want to engage in it is the concern. Is it the fact that they are engaging in this sexual behaviour on a frequent basis? So it's that duration, how long it's been going on for, the frequency of it, and elements of maybe preoccupation, despite putting in place some distraction type behavior. So despite other things happening in their life, despite other young people who they are in contact with having other activities, this young person is choosing to engage in sexual behavior. And it's about therefore looking about who are they seeking to engage in that behavior with. So that victim profile, are they choosing much younger children? Are they choosing children who would be seen to be maybe more vulnerable, and maybe more vulnerable due to disability? Are they choosing victims whom they're in a position of trust? So for example, maybe they are a prefect at school, maybe in the sports arena, maybe they are the older person who maybe takes the younger kids for some minor skills sort of training. So are they choosing to engage in a sexual behavior with somebody who they have not only a position of trust, but also a position of authority and power, which can still be evident with our young people, because they're given those positions in school, they're given those positions in clubs, they're given those positions because that's part of them graduating their way through life. But what we could maybe see is that maybe that's what's being exploited. So think about that in terms of that position and that role. but also who are they choosing. There's also something then about the currency of the abuse and how current it is and what role it has to play. Or that maybe, for example, it might be that they did engage in that period, that and during a period of time, but not now, but it's only coming to your attention now. So you might find you've got a disclosure from a young person about what somebody did to them, but it was maybe last year or 2 years ago. That for me doesn't matter if that young person has never received help. We would still want to make sure that that young person gets help. So what I want to think about is that young people who engage in and moving into those, the amber and the red, in terms of concern, moving into and problematic, moving into that harmful, is they will either engage in those behaviours because of what they've observed, and that observation doesn't mean to say it's been an abusive observation, but they have observed maybe through themselves looking and coming across things on TV or coming across things on the internet. Maybe they typed in something and it led them on to something else in a very innocent way, but they've been exposed to it. So you've observation, but they also can be observation because they've been made to watch inappropriate material. So listen out for that. So maybe they have been made to watch adult pornography by an older sibling, by an older friend, but maybe also by an adult. So again, it's about observation. So are they doing behaviors that they have observed, but been observed through non-abusive ways or through potentially abusive ways? Also, that they will maybe engage in harmful or problematic sexual behaviours because that's what they have experienced. And once they've been sexually abused and sexualized, that stimulus is there and they maybe want their bodies to experience it again. And they're trying to repeat that experience and feel those feelings. And they're trying to understand what's going on with their body. So it's about experience and repeating an experience that's happened to them. Sometimes it's because they want knowledge and they want to understand what's happening to their body. Sometimes it's because they have not been given that knowledge, which is why I am genuinely asking you to be very clear. See green as an invitation to educate. The more education our young people have and our children have as they developmentally go right through life, the better they are equipped to understand their body, others' bodies, and how it works. So sometimes we have young people who engage in problematic sexual behaviour because it's how they're trying to inform themselves as to sex education. Sometimes it's peer influenced, is because they think young people, for example, particularly adolescents, are very quick to say, oh, I have done, and they want to be seen to be part of the group. So sometimes young people will engage in that behaviour because they think all their friends are doing it. Or also because maybe they have been dared to do it, maybe it's part of a gang. But peer influenced is quite a significant part to play in harmful sexual behaviour. And sometimes it's because the young person and the child might have learning difficulties, and therefore that they maybe see their peers who don't have a learning difficulty, maybe they see their peers engaging in a behaviour and they want to do it, but they don't understand the nuances of it. So they don't understand, for example, maybe the nuances of consent, and particularly how the nuances of a non-verbal consent, what does that look like? And they maybe engage in that behaviour with a younger child. So sometimes a learning difficulty can be, and that's linked very much to knowledge. It's linked very much maybe to what they've observed and they don't quite understand what they've observed and they think they understand it. So what I want you to think about is, in terms of this level one, beginning to, when you see a behaviour, think about the context, think about what have they observed, what about the experience as to why this young person might be doing that behaviour. And in terms then of intervening, like I said, to just recap, it's the importance of addressing that behaviour in a non-judgmental manner. Remember, we have a role to educate, and particularly at that green level, and explain with clarity as to what you're worried about. Obviously, then, if you're not the parents, speak with the parents. And as I said to you, that's also then about partly then understanding, is the parental response something that reassures you? Is the parental response of concern? Or is that parental response, is that something you're genuinely worried about and that nearly in itself would come into a red? But reassuring the child, because the one thing we want to be able to do here is see that young people's sexuality and their sexual behaviour, they are sexual beings. And that therefore it's not about telling them that their sexuality is wrong and that their sexual expression is wrong. What we're trying to help them understand is about that they need guidance and how to manage their sexuality, particularly when they've come into that amber and red areas. What we're not wanting to give them a message of is that their exploration and their sexual thoughts or everything about that is wrong. What we're trying to say is that at this stage, for your developmental stage, the knowledge you have is beyond what you should know. Your body has been stimulated beyond what you're able to manage. So it's about helping that young person manage their sexuality safely and then therefore in a supportive way, because we're looking to prevent and we're looking for them to have a much more proactive but safe sexual experience. So it's about seeking to provide education, but that also when you have a young person and you can identify and that child within the amber, please don't wait to red. You may initially see a red concern. It might be clearly problematic, clearly harmful, clearly abusive, and there's no concern in relation to what you're seeing. But what I would want you to do is make sure don't lose sight of the ambers and referring them through to your Trust Gateway social work teams and the specialist HSB services. But also those are great for ringing up and checking out if you're worried or if you're concerned. But you can also, for example, also use services such as NSPCC as well, and looking at the NSPCC website, the Parent Protects website, any of those websites to help you to figure out what you're seeing and check it out. Most organisations as well obviously will have safeguarding policies and procedures and a safeguarding designated officer. Check out with them what you have seen and are you worried about it. But as far as I'm concerned, if it warrants you to run it past somebody, it's something that's causing you some concern. And if it's causing you some concern, it's probably hitting that amber. And it's about listening to your gut feeling on that and not saying that therefore to raise that through is going to label the child. See it as a proactive way to educate and to prevent something from happening further. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that has been of benefit to you. My understanding is that this will be followed through now with a level 2, but for now this is a level 1. I hope that you find it useful and certainly use each one of those slides as just a guide to begin to understand of what is normal, what is of concern, and therefore what is harmful, and that hopefully that you will see it as more confidence in being able to address sexual behaviour with children, but in a proactive way and in a positive way. Thank you.